right, so today we're talking to JP Harvey. JP's founder and Chief Information Security Officer at Cloud Quarterback, your virtual information security team. So JP, we're really excited to be talking to you today. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So can you tell us a little bit about Cloud Quarterback?
Sure. So Cloud Quarterback is the simplest way for companies to meet their security and compliance needs. We essentially put a virtual security team into, with a company, and we take care of all their security and compliance.
And what sort of customers do you typically target with Cloud Quarterback?
Typically like 20 to 200 people. They're too small to have their own security staff, but they have a security need typically. So they have important information they want to protect, or they have a compliance need because they need to be, they're in healthcare or retail or financial services. So we take the security burden off their plate, and they can focus on their core business.
Okay. And before we continue, if people want to find out more about Cloud Quarterback, how can they get in touch with you?
Our website's the best way, cloudquarterback.com.
Okay. Fantastic. So one of the key audiences for us is tech startups and small businesses. You've obviously got quite a lot of experience being an entrepreneur in that space. And one of the challenges of small growing companies is the need to hire people quickly. But in such a small business, each new person can make a huge difference, and hiring the wrong person can be very costly. So what non-job specific things do you look for when you're hiring top talent?
Look, you need someone, we found that, and it's actually more important than their technical skill, is to have someone in there who not only is intelligent, but who can make decisions and isn't afraid to kind of move sideways in their role if they need to. So if something needs to be done, they'll do it. And they can make a decision to do something, not be indecisive or put everything off until they get input from someone else.
And how do you qualify that in the process of hiring?
Look, it's mostly question based. We've also started to use a service, Pomelo, which establishes cultural fit and that kind of thing. So that helps as well. We haven't got it down to an exact science. And there are times where you take people on as either part-time or on a trial to see how well they fit as well.
Right. JP, how can leaders build a culture that overcomes a fear of failure and encourages experimentation?
Well, look, this is something that I actually personally struggled with for years. I'm a technical person, and I think for a long time things for me were a little bit black and white, right and wrong. This is the right way to do things. And my clients were used to me doing the work. And so I went through quite a journey being able to delegate to staff. And I think the biggest things were allowing people to make mistakes. So even if you can see they're going down a path where they're going to make this mistake, obviously not a catastrophic one, you let them do it and you let them learn from it, rather than picking them up along the way. And then also letting them do the job, 80% as well as you would do it, if you like.
Yeah.
And understanding that they're never going to do it exactly the same way.
Right.
So I suppose for me, it was about overcoming those, and that's what I've tried to build into the culture. Like it's okay to make mistakes because that's how you learn. And it's okay to have your own way that you do things as long as you stick to the processes.
So I recently read something that says, a job done 80% by someone else is better than a job done 100% by you. Do you subscribe to that belief?
Absolutely. There's, you quickly run out of time if you're trying to manage everything.
I agree. So in startups and small businesses, there's often new CEOs and people that are new to managing other people. One of the things that I've found is particularly tricky for new managers is to get their management meetings right. It's often there might be too many people in the meeting, or maybe the agenda isn't clear, or action points aren't captured properly. So how do you structure and run your management meetings?
Look, being quite small, we've not really had those kinds of issues. So yeah, our management meetings, we haven't really had them per se.
Right.
We haven't had a bunch of people in our meetings, so they've been small enough that the discussion hasn't needed to be particularly structured.
Yeah. And how do you, in that case, how do you kind of agree on what actions need to be taken and follow them through to completion?
I suppose it's just a matter of, I guess, discussion and then creating, post-meeting tasks.
Right. On that note, I want to drill a little on your personal productivity. There's many kind of different techniques out there for productivity, methodologies like David Allen's Getting Things Done, there's the Pomodoro technique and many others. The one thing that is consistently surfaced in the research that I've read basically says that there's no one size that fits all. It's different for everyone. So I wanted to ask you, do you use any particular productivity methodology?
I've done a fair bit of reading over the years in productivity because I found that, you get to a point where you run out of time very quickly.
Yes.
And, David Allen's Getting Things Done is really good. But none of these frameworks have really been able to really adopt myself as a structured framework.
Right.
So I suppose the closest thing I probably do is there's Brian Tracy's time management book. I actually, it's more like I took some tips from that and some tips from a bunch of other stuff.
Yes.
And kind of put it together. And so, the way I kind of do it now is that I've got long-term goals, medium-term goals, and then I kind of come down to, yearly, quarterly, monthly, and weekly, and then daily. And so I just kind of move up the chain that way. And that's basically the Brian Tracy technique.
Okay, fantastic.
And that seems to work pretty well for me. But the ones with a lot of structure, I've not been able to really make work for me.
And do you use any particular tools to help you keep track of those goals over the different timeframes?
I do. So it always used to be spreadsheet based, and
Yep.
I used to dip in and out of that. I found that was, there's quite a bit of admin around doing that, and I'm not really an admin person.
Yeah.
What changed, and I've tried productivity tools too, and what changed that for me was I started using a tool called Habit RPG, and it's a gamification of managing tasks.
Yeah.
And the game itself is ridiculous. It's like it's almost for kids.
Yeah.
But and it looks really ridiculous, it looks for kids, and it feels a bit funny that I use this system to manage my time. But the kind of reward system has, for whatever reason, kept me using it.
Okay, great. Tell me something. What does your typical day look like?
I suppose my day revolves around, it's a mix of business development, so looking for leads and, speaking to potential customers, dealing with, some customer issues, doing planned work for customers, and then managing what my staff are doing.
And do you have any particular approach to when you have meetings in the day? Are you someone that likes to get meetings done in the mornings or afternoon?
Yeah, I've done a bit of experimentation with that because typically I prefer the afternoons. But I find that meetings in the afternoons tend to go longer.
Right.
And then half the time, you think, I'll just go home now. And it kind of puts you in a different mental state. So I've actually found meetings in the morning seem to go faster. And then, you just go to work. There's not this, do I go home and just, it's a little bit less lackadaisical if you get them done in the morning.
And do you put time in your calendar to, complete certain tasks? How do you get the things done that are on your lists?
Yeah, so that's actually the one of the it's probably the biggest productivity boost that I've ever personally implemented was scheduling every day.
Right.
So, I look at my task list and I'll put down things that I do every day in there at a certain time, and essentially fill it up. And I try to stick to it. I don't kind of beat myself up if I don't stick to it. But that's made a massive difference to how much I get done.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have spoken to a few other people that have said something similar, that you need to have a methodology, whatever it may be, and you need to be disciplined about it, but you also have to have a degree of flexibility because things inevitably change. It's very unpredictable.
Exactly, yeah. And things run over time, and you're always, optimistic about how long they're going to take. So yeah, you've got to be able to flex a bit.
So one of the things that people are struggling with these days is obviously information overload. We're getting emails in at a rate that we often can't manage. There's articles and newsletters we want to read or are sent to us or recommended. We've got notes from meetings, even text messages and chat messages coming in at any time of the day. How do you deal with information overflow?
Look, I find, particularly with email, you end up subscribing to a lot of garbage. You get a lot of garbage that you've thought, I want that information one day, and you may even stay on these lists to get the odd snippet of information. I've been a little bit more ruthless recently about unsubscribing from these things, which give me something valuable once a year.
Yep.
I've determined that that's not valuable if it's only valuable once a year.
Yeah.
I do find that what's more challenging is that, I might have a white paper that comes through and I'll want to read that in the future. Saving those to folders works okay, but there's quite a few which I don't end up reading.
Yeah.
So a lot of information kind of falls out that way, and I'm not happy with the way that I currently manage that kind of data.
Why do you say that?
Well, just because I know that I'd like to read that information, but I'll just forget that it's in the folder, or
Right.
it's never front of mind.
Right.
And I think the same thing with web pages. You might see an article on a web page you want to read, but you're in the middle of something. I don't have a perfect system for saving that for later to read. I'll save them in a folder, but then I'll never get to it, or by the time I do, I've got 100 there. So, I don't have a day to go through all of them. So that's a little bit of a challenge personally. But I tend to subscribe again to the, if you like your clothes, if you haven't worn it in 6 to 12 months, you may as well just get rid of it. So if the data's there and you haven't needed it in the last 6 to 12 months, you probably don't need it.
I think that's a policy I could subscribe to, particularly with the clothes. So on that note, every startup has a million things to do. There's as you sort of mentioned earlier, there's short-term tasks. For many businesses, that might be writing a proposal or presenting to investors. And then I often find that conducting or getting those things done for the short term come at the risk of potentially longer term goals not getting done. And that might be things like releasing a product or entering a new market. What tips do you have for balancing your urgent short term tasks with medium and longer term business goals?
So I suppose my experience has been exactly that it's quite typical that you're so focused on the things you have to do today or this week, the long-term things get forgotten. And what really helped me was making sure, actually review all my goals every day. So all those long-term goals that, there's 5 of them or something, they're quite high level. And then just making sure that something that you're doing during the day is vaguely moving you in that direction, even if it's a 5, 10, 15-minute thing.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest thing, because, if it's always in your mind, you're always chipping away at it.
And do you stop and reflect on those things and make sure that, to try and make sure you've got that alignment between what you're doing in the immediate term and what you're trying to achieve over the longer term?
Yeah, so I always try to make sure that either one of my daily goals or maybe a larger weekly goal is in some way aligned with one of those, long-term goals.
So you'd be doing that on a daily basis then?
Yeah, or it might be one that I put in weekly that's a slightly bigger thing.
And JP, how do you help your team members prioritize their work correctly?
I kind of, in a sense, this goes back to your question about hiring the right people.
Right.
We look for people who can self-manage quite a bit in terms of prioritization and decision making. So I've opted for that direction in terms of dealing with that mostly. I would say that we've got a company policy that everyone schedules their day the same way that I do in their calendar.
Wow.
And without exception, we haven't had anyone who's come into the company who's done that beforehand.
Yeah.
And every single person is blown away the first day about how much they get done.
Wow. And so do you train them on how to do that?
Yeah. And I mean, the training's 5 minutes,
Right.
It's like just, put this in and leave yourself a couple of hours at the end of the day to push things out or add things in or shuffle them around.
So the trick is mainly to have the discipline to actually schedule your calendar, your calendar for that day, sort of on an hourly kind of basis.
Yeah, so I do mine in 10-minute chunks, but typically there's not much I schedule for 10 minutes. Most of it would be kind of 20 to 60.
Yeah.
We have a policy that you don't schedule anything for longer than. We use 40-minute chunks typically as the longest, but you can go up to 60.
Why that length of time?
Well, we don't. It might be different if you're a developer, but our guys are security guys and sysadmins, and people's attention isn't unlimited. And once I've read studies about attention, and it's a good idea to either switch tasks or have some kind of break in between. But I think the biggest benefit of the calendar that people find when they first start doing it is it gives them permission to focus on one thing, because you've always got distractions. You've got emails coming in, you've got support tickets. Some people have support tickets, whatever it is. And it's really tempting to go, I need to do that because it's bugging me. And people love the fact that they're allowed to do something for 40 minutes or an hour without having to check their email or, log into a support queue.
I think that's a brilliant insight. I think the terminology you used around, having the permission to focus on just one thing. I mean, it's astounding really that people need to feel that way, because they're so kind of overwhelmed, but it's an inevitability in the way we operate these days. And I think It sounds like it's really a cultural thing in your business to make sure that people are comfortable with that.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. JP, when you've got a small business, and particularly in tech startups, you're thrown in the deep end and you're doing a bunch of different stuff, as we've touched on. A lot of the time you've got multiple different projects on the go, and in many cases they're kind of unstructured. There's not much project management formality applied to them. So just going back to the basics for an untrained project manager, in your experience, what are the key elements to a successfully run project?
So having done a fair bit of project management, fairly formal, we implemented a formal project management system in the last business that I had in Australia.
Okay.
I think the biggest thing was, for us, it was mentoring people in good project management, processes and methodologies. We took kind of the PMI process, all of their processes, and we kind of pushed out a fairly light version of that.
Mm-hmm.
And
why
really
a light
helped.
version?
The PMBOK is PMI's body of knowledge, and it's it's designed for massive projects. And when you're a small company, if you're going to apply that to every project, just give up now. You'll spend all your time communicating this and documenting that, and you need to do those things if you're running a team which is several different departments or whatever. But when there's a few people doing the work and you've got very few communication channels, it's a high burden. But the high level of what that achieves is important to understand. And we actually, I think this will stand out for our guys in our Sydney business. One day, in order to illustrate this, we on our Friday meeting, we cooked a roast chicken for lunch.
Okay.
Our office had an oven.
I like where this is going.
Yeah, everyone did at the end. So we essentially, I brought in a chicken and some veggies and said, this is what you're going to do today. And, we mapped out the critical path on the whiteboard about what, the milestones and what could be done in parallel. And, the guys loved it. I think that taught them more about project management than anything else we did.
It sounds brilliant, actually. What is it that they took away from that, do you think? What were the key things they learned?
I think the key thing was the critical path. Okay. And, timing, you can put your chicken in now, your veggies have to go in then, but, you can't go past this particular point or you're going to overcook your chicken and the criteria was everything had to be ready at once. And so that they understood that, you have to end up at the end with this kind of whole package as opposed to, we finished this, but the veggies are still in the oven kind of thing.
So you mean like the discipline of actually mapping out the critical path and understanding what's on the critical path in advance?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And look, we didn't always do that formally in projects. Mm-hmm. But if people understand the concept of that after they've done it a few times, for the smaller projects, it just becomes second nature.
And what level of documentation do you think is necessary for a small, even agile project?
It really depends on the project. So if you're doing something like software development, I think, you're doing something like Scrum anyway, and you've got things like Jira, which you can probably use that as just your documentation if it's a fairly small project. For what we generally do, we've got systems designed to produce documentation. I think it comes down a lot to the project, and you probably want to document as much as you can that, firstly, if it's a deliverable, and secondly, enough to make sure that you can teach other people about it or other people can learn from it, and it becomes a more repeatable process.
I think that idea of knowledge transfer is really important. Now, if I understand correctly, you've actually done a kind of an unusual level of certification in the past. Is that right?
Yeah, the previous business that I ended up selling in Sydney was an IT service management company, so a managed service provider.
Yep.
And we actually certified the company to ISO 20000. We were one of 13 companies in Australia who had, ended up doing certification, which involves, you have to put a lot of process in place around best practices in IT. And then you have external auditors come in and verify that you actually follow those processes and, to produce evidence for that.
So you would have had to have some pretty rigid documentation around those processes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we did. There's quite a lot of documentation. And it was unusual for a company so small to kind of take that on.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly rewarding. For the staff and, the company.
Why do you say that? What was rewarding about it?
Look, I think a couple of levels. I think on a personal level, the guys felt like they were doing something special and they were learning something special, because the fact of the matter is, most managed service providers probably do 20-30% of what's in that kind of best practice standard. So from a growth point of view, it was great for the staff. But it took us from almost being, I'll exaggerate, but before we were fighting fires more, we were managing incidents more, and we were reacting more. And after we did it, the level of that changed. You know, we were managing the same number of incidents day to day, but we were responding to them. We weren't reacting to them. Mm-hmm. And there was more of a discipline around continuous improvement and problem management and finding the root cause of problems. So it actually calmed things down a lot.
Wow. And do you think that the process of getting that certification and understanding those requirements at such a deep level influenced the way you kind of manage your business now?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I don't think I'd get that certification again for any business. What I really got out of it, well, because it is a little bit, that one's a little bit niche.
Right.
But now I feel like I know that information and I could implement it without having to have someone come in and kind of verify it. But I would get certified to other standards.
And is that because you think that it's a valuable process to go? I mean, obviously there's a benefit to your business because you can kind of advertise that you're compliant with certain certifications, but is it also part of the process? You think it's a beneficial process for you and your team to go through?
Yeah, definitely. It's good to have that discipline. I think it teaches the discipline as well. Mm. And, a lot of people in smaller businesses might never have worked for a larger company either. Yeah. So they've never been exposed to a lot of process. Mm-hmm. And, you've got to be really careful in a small business how heavy-handed you are with kind of, rigid processes. Yeah. And what you make rigid and what you make loose. Mm-hmm. But certainly they benefit from understanding which of the parts need to be rigid and why.
So it sounds like you're pretty big on making sure people understand the fundamental principles of kind of project management. And also I see a theme of making sure people learn to plan ahead and see ahead a little bit. Yes. But you're not necessarily kind of rigidly applying any one particular project management down to the nth degree.
No. So like I say, we had a project management process and some templates, but it was fairly loose in terms of the guys followed it, but they didn't have prescribed email templates to send to people. It wasn't you have to do this, and if you don't do this, then project's wrong. It was like this project's too small to really bother having a communications plan. You've got to talk to this one person about it and let them know how it's going. So we had a process, and parts could be left out if required.
So at ScribblePost, we're pretty passionate, as I'm sure you can understand, about helping other people improve their productivity. And you've given some phenomenal insight to the way you do it, so appreciate that. But I don't think there's a company around that isn't interested in improving their productivity in one way or the other. So, what's the number one thing you would tell other companies to help them lift their productivity?
If they're not already doing it, hands down, it's scheduling your day. Right. That's the thing that I think's made the biggest difference for us.
So it's kind of like a cultural thing, but also down to the individual level, making sure people are actually spending the time and have the discipline to think ahead about what they're doing that day and schedule it in at a pretty granular level.
Absolutely, yeah.
JP, I've just got one last question for you. Okay, you ready for it?
Okay, go.
Putting aside global goodwill and things like world peace and philanthropy, what would be the most exciting news headline you could hope to read in the next 10 years, and why?
Yeah, I think a really big thing would be quantum encryption, being a security person.
Okay, and not understanding encryption too well myself, help me understand what benefit would that bring?
So I guess at the moment, there are a few things that there are some downsides about encryption. Mm-hmm. And what quantum encryption, the potential for that is that someone reading the data actually changes the data when they read it. Okay. So that it would mean that no one, that there would be you could verify the integrity and that no one had read it, for example. Right. And other things where, like, today's encryption methods could be potentially broken in seconds as opposed to hundreds of years.
Right.
With advancements in quantum computing.
JP, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
My pleasure. It's been great. Thanks.